The morning began like any other, or at least it pretended to. The apartment was quiet, too quiet, and I sat at the kitchen table staring at the dark swirl of coffee in my cup, as if it could offer answers I wasn't ready to face. Outside the window, the street was waking up, the crunch of tires on gravel, the muffled bark of a neighbor's dog, the faint call of a paperboy's bicycle bell. It all sounded distant, like another life playing out on the other side of a thin wall. Inside, every second seemed heavier than it should have been. She had told me the night before that she would be staying with a friend. The words had slipped off her tongue casually, like a well-rehearsed line, as though she knew I wouldn't push too hard. But the moment the front door closed behind her, a strange unease crept in, slow and insidious. It sat with me through the evening, through the hours past midnight, and even into the pale gray dawn. I had tried to dismiss it, telling myself I was overanalyzing, imagining things, falling victim to the kind of suspicious thinking that ruins relationships. Still, I couldn't escape the feeling that something wasn't right. When I heard the turn of her key in the lock, my chest tightened. It was a small sound, a metallic scrape, but it was enough to send a jolt through me. I didn't get up. I just sat there, waiting, every muscle tense, every nerve listening. She walked in as if nothing unusual had happened. Her coat hung loosely on her shoulders, and her hair was slightly tousled, not in the way it usually was when she spent the night tossing in bed, but in a different way, a way that suggested another set of hands had been near her. The first thing that hit me wasn't her voice or her presence but the scent. It wasn't her perfume. It wasn't even something I had smelled in our home before. It was sharp, expensive, the kind of cologne sold behind glass counters with security tags. Masculine. And it clung stubbornly to her coat, weaving into the fabric as if marking its territory. Then my eyes found it. A faint discoloration along the side of her neck. Not a bruise, not exactly, but the kind of mark that skin carries after being touched too roughly or too mately. The sight of it froze me. My fingers tightened around the handle of my coffee cup until it nearly slipped from the sweat on my palm. I wanted to believe it was nothing, a shadow, a trick of the morning light filtering through the blinds. But my instincts screamed otherwise. She saw me looking. She saw my eyes narrow, my lips press into a thin line. For the briefest moment, there was a flicker, a hesitation in her step, a pause in her breath. But it passed quickly, and she regained her composure with frightening ease. She set her bag down on the counter, unzipped it, and without a word pulled out a toothbrush and a paperback novel. She placed them deliberately on the counter, as if laying down evidence in a trial. Proof, she was saying silently. Proof that she had done nothing wrong. Her movements were slow, measured, rehearsed. She didn't rush, didn't falter, didn't look away. She moved with the confidence of someone who had already planned her story and had rehearsed it in the mirror before walking through the door. Everything about her posture declared innocence, or at least the illusion of it. The smell of the cologne was still there, though sharp against the faint aroma of toothpaste that clung to the toothbrush. The contradiction was too much. My mind twisted itself into knots. I wanted to demand answers, to unleash the storm that was building in my chest. But I didn't. Instead, I watched her. And in that silence, I realized something chilling. She wasn't scrambling to explain herself. She wasn't even afraid. She was calm. Too calm. It wasn't the calm of someone wrongly accused. It was the calm of someone who had already decided how the story would go. She was turning the suspicion back onto me, making it seem like my imagination had invented the mark on her neck, the cologne in the air, the long hours of absence. An innocent evening. Her presence seemed to insist. You're paranoid. You're seeing ghosts where there are none. But I wasn't imagining. Couldn't be. I thought about the nights she had started keeping her phone face down on the table, the messages she typed and erased before pressing send, the mysterious work dinners that ended long after the office lights were out. I thought about the way she came home glowing instead of tired, how laughter sometimes clung to her even after she had stepped into our silent home. I had swallowed those doubts, buried them, convinced myself they weren't worth the confrontation. And now they were staring back at me in the form of a faint mark and a foreign scent. Still, I said nothing. Words seemed powerless in that moment. She had already armed herself with objects, gestures, composure. If I accused her, she would point to the toothbrush, to the book, to her steady eyes, and call me paranoid. She would twist my doubt into weakness, make me question myself until I no longer trusted my own senses. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have expected, was that I had already prepared my own kind of truth. On the kitchen table, placed there the night before when the weight of my unease became unbearable, was a single sheet of paper. Just one. No explanations, no accusations, no desperate pleas for honesty. Only a few words written in heavy strokes. My pen pressed so hard into the page that it had nearly torn through. Don't come back. Good luck with him. It sat there between the salt shaker and a folded napkin. Innocent at first glance, devastating once read. When her eyes finally landed on it, she froze. Not long, not dramatically, but just enough for me to see the mask slip. For a fraction of a second, there was a flash of recognition of something raw. Then it was gone, replaced again by that terrifying composure. She blinked, reached for a glass, and poured herself some water as though the note were nothing more than a misplaced grocery list. But I saw it. I saw the hesitation, the microsecond of truth before she buried it under layers of indifference. And in that small flicker, I knew I wasn't wrong. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. I could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall, each second louder than the last, pounding in my ears like a hammer driving in nails. She took a sip of her water, her hand steady, and for the first time I realized just how far apart we already were. She was standing a few feet from me, but it felt like we lived in two different worlds. I didn't say a word, neither did she, but the silence between us wasn't neutral anymore. It was charged, electric, the kind of silence that comes when two people know everything has changed but neither wants to acknowledge it out loud. And as she set her glass down, as she adjusted the strap of her coat, as she pretended that piece of paper wasn't burning a hole through her soul, I understood something I hadn't before. Our marriage wasn't collapsing in slow motion. It had already collapsed. What I was witnessing now was just the echo of its fall. After she walked out that morning, the apartment turned into a hollow shell. The silence didn't comfort me. It pressed against my chest, loud in its emptiness. For hours I wandered from room to room without purpose, unable to shake the images that had already rooted themselves into my mind. The faint mark on her neck, the scent of cologne that had no place on her coat, the flicker in her eyes when she saw my note. I told myself I should feel lighter now that everything was out in the open, that the silent agreement between us had been broken and the truth had revealed itself. But instead, I felt weighed down by something far heavier. The accumulation of every small, suspicious moment I had ignored, excused, or pushed aside. With her gone, there was nothing left to distract me from the patterns. I sat in the living room with my phone in my hand, staring at its black screen, and one by one, the memories replayed themselves like scenes from a movie I had already seen too many times but never understood until now. There was the way she had started keeping her phone face down on the table. It had seemed innocent at first, just a habit, I told myself. But I remembered how quickly she reached for it whenever it buzzed. The way her fingers curled protectively around the device, her eyes darting toward me as if to measure whether I noticed. Sometimes she muted it completely, sliding it into her pocket, slipping away into the bathroom for just long enough to make me wonder what was so private, so urgent, that it couldn't be said within my hearing. And then the late nights, meetings that stretched until midnight, deadlines that somehow demanded her presence in places I could never confirm. She would come home not weary, not drained as one should after hours of overtime, but glowing. Her cheeks flushed, her eyes bright, her energy strange, like someone who had been revived instead of exhausted. She carried that lightness into the house, and when I asked how work had been, she smiled a little too easily, said busy a little too smoothly. At the time, I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think I was married to someone simply thriving in her career. But now, alone in the quiet, I understood that glow for what it was. The residue of another man's attention. The evidence hadn't always been invisible either. Once, while cleaning her car, I had found a receipt crumpled on the back seat. It was from a restaurant I had never been to with her, a place too far from her office, too fancy for a casual lunch. 2 glasses of wine were listed, along with a shared entree. The sight of it had made my stomach tighten. I had held the paper in my hand for a long time, debating whether to confront her. But when I finally did, she had laughed it off, saying it was just a dinner with colleagues, a harmless team outing. She explained so quickly, so fluidly, that I almost believed her. Almost. But the seed of doubt had planted itself that day, and it had been growing silently ever since. I could still recall the first time she came home with that faint scent on her skin. Not perfume, not soap, not anything that belonged to her. Something foreign, subtle, fleeting. I had leaned in, kissed her cheek, and caught it before it vanished into the air. She smiled, distracted, brushing me off, and I convinced myself it was nothing. A stranger's cologne lingering in an elevator, perhaps. Passing whiff on the street. Now I realized how carefully I had wanted to believe those harmless explanations, how willingly I had painted over the cracks so the walls wouldn't crumble. It wasn't just the physical signs. It was the way her mood shifted. She had once filled the house with her presence, talking, laughing, sharing even the smallest details of her day. But gradually, she had begged *N to retreat into herself. Conversations became shorter, her answers clipped, her attention elsewhere even when she sat across from me at dinner. Her eyes would flicker to her phone. Her lips would twitch into half-smiles at private thoughts she didn't share. I had become background noise in my own home, while some unseen world pulled her farther away from me. And then there was that Saturday morning. I had woken up early, reached for her, and found the bed cold. She was in the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, her back to me. She spoke in a low voice, too low for me to catch the words, but the tone, *mate, hushed, was enough. When she realized I was standing there, she ended the call abruptly, her explanation tumbling out too quickly. Just a colleague. I pretended to believe her, but I didn't sleep well for nights after that. Now, with her absence filling the apartment, those scattered memories came together like puzzle pieces. Each one had been small enough to ignore on its own, easy to brush aside, but assembled into a picture, the truth was undeniable. I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't imagining things. I had been living beside a woman who was slipping away into another life, leaving me to guard the shadows of our marriage. The worst part wasn't just the betrayal itself, but how easily I had been willing to blind myself. I thought of the years we had built together, the laughter we had shared, the plans we had made. I thought of the vows we had exchanged, words that once felt sacred. And then I thought of how effortlessly she had lied, how seamlessly she had maintained her other world. The contrast cut deep. I stood, restless, pacing the length of the living room. The ticking of the clock grew unbearable, its rhythm mocking the time I had wasted convincing myself she was still mine. I tried to remember when exactly the shift had begged *N, the precise moment she had stopped belonging to me. But there was no clear answer. It hadn't been a sudden fracture. It had been a slow erosion, steady and merciless, like waves wearing down stone. By the time I noticed, too much had already been lost. I walked into the bedroom, opened her drawer, and found it nearly empty. She had taken more clothes than she had let on when she claimed to spend the night at her friend's. Another lie layered on top of a mountain of others. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands clasped, and felt the weight of finality pressing down. The house smelled faintly of her shampoo, of her presence, but it was no longer a comfort. It was an echo, a haunting. Every object reminded me of her duplicity. The book she had left on the nightstand, the sweater draped over the chair, the framed photographs on the dresser. They were no longer memories of love. They were evidence in a case that no longer needed a jury. And yet, even as I sat surrounded by these signs, part of me resisted. Part of me still wanted to believe I was wrong, that I had misread everything, that paranoia had twisted me into seeing things that weren't there. That small, desperate part clung to the fantasy of her honesty like a drowning man clings to driftwood. But the deeper I fell into the memories, the harder it became to deny. Each recollection sharpened the truth, etched it deeper into my mind. She was gone, and she had been leaving long before I realized it. I pressed my palms against my eyes, trying to push back the sting, but all I could see was her glowing face as she returned home from those meetings. Her smile too wide, too secret. I heard again the muffled laughter through the bathroom door, the sharp edge of her voice when I asked too many questions. And I saw the receipt, the wine glasses, the mark on her neck. It all formed a story I didn't want to read, but couldn't avoid anymore. By evening, the weight of suspicion had hardened into something else. Resolve. I wasn't just a man with doubts anymore. I was a man who knew, even without the final proof in front of me. And knowing was far more devastating than wondering had ever been. The day had been long, but not in the usual sense of work and obligations. It was long because my mind refused to rest, circling the same thoughts like a predator waiting for its prey to stumble. Every sound seemed amplified. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, the faint murmur of voices drifting up from the street below. All of them reminders that the world outside was moving forward while mine had stopped. By late afternoon, the silence of the apartment became unbearable. I couldn't sit still any longer, couldn't let myself rot in the stew of my suspicions. I needed something concrete, something undeniable. Suspicion was corrosive, but proof was absolute. I wanted certainty even if it would destroy me. Her patterns had been consistent, and one place had come up again and again in her casual explanations. A bar. She called it just a spot with friends. Her go-to line whenever she slipped out for the evening. Too casual, too rehearsed. Tonight I decided I would follow the thread and see where it led. The drive there was quiet, the kind of quiet that suffocates. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, knuckles pale, every muscle strung with tension. The streets blurred past, neon lights flickering in the corners of my vision. I didn't even need directions. I had heard her mention the bar enough times to know exactly where it was. When I pulled into the parking lot, the first thing I noticed was her car. It was there, unmistakable, sitting under a dim streetlight as though it had been waiting for me. The sight of it made my stomach clench. Seeing her car was proof enough that she hadn't lied about her destination. But it didn't ease me. Instead, it sharpened my focus. I stepped out of my own car and approached hers, the night air heavy with the faint scent of cigarette smoke and spilled beer. On the passenger seat inside her vehicle was a man's jacket. Not hers, not mine. It was large, dark, neatly folded in a way that told me it didn't belong there by accident. The fabric looked expensive, far more so than anything I owned. My pulse quickened as I leaned closer, spotting something else tucked beneath it. A folded piece of paper. I pulled the door handle, surprised when it opened easily. She hadn't even locked it. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the paper. It was a receipt, not from the bar, but from a hotel nearby. A room booked for 2. The date was today, the time was just an hour earlier. The ground shifted beneath me. Every suspicion, every fragment of doubt, every small sign I had ignored was suddenly condensed into this undeniable fact in my hands. She wasn't simply out with friends. She was here with him, and they had made no attempt to hide it. I climbed back into my car, the receipt clutched tightly, and drove toward the hotel listed. My chest ached with every beat of my heart, my thoughts a violent storm. Part of me still hoped I was wrong, that the room was a coincidence, that she wasn't behind that door. But deep down, I knew. The hotel wasn't far. A bland building lit with fluorescent lights that gave the parking lot a sterile glow. I walked inside, my steps heavy, my breath shallow. At the front desk, the clerk barely looked up as I asked about the room number. I gave her name, my voice low, steady despite the chaos inside me. The clerk confirmed without hesitation. She had checked in not long ago. I felt dizzy, as though the air had thinned around me. This was no longer suspicion or imagination. It was fact, confirmed by strangers who had no stake in my unraveling marriage. Still, I forced myself forward, toward the hallway lined with doors that seemed to stretch endlessly. As I reached the room, my hand hovered over the door, my pulse drumming in my ears. I could hear faint noises inside. Laughter, the clinking of glasses, the muffled sound of a man's voice. Then, suddenly, her laughter rose, bright and careless. A sound that once belonged to me and now belonged to someone else. I knocked. There was a shuffle, hurried whispers, the sound of movement. The door opened a moment later, and there she was, framed in the doorway. She wore a hotel robe loosely tied at the waist, her hair falling in waves around her shoulders, her face still glowing. For a second, she froze, and so did I. Behind her, in the blurred background of the room, a man stood buttoning his shirt. He looked up, and when his face came into focus, the world I thought I knew collapsed completely. It was Michael. Michael. My friend of years, my confidant. The man who had stood beside me at my wedding and toasted to our happiness. The same man who had shared beers with me on quiet nights, who had called me brother, who had pretended to be loyal while secretly stealing everything I had built. My throat closed. Rage and disbelief collided inside me, threatening to tear me apart. The betrayal wasn't just hers anymore. It was his too. It wasn't just my marriage that had been corrupted, but the trust one had extended to someone I had once believed incapable of this kind of treachery. Her eyes darted between me and Michael, her lips parting as though she wanted to speak, but no words came out. She didn't look guilty. She didn't even look ashamed. She looked startled, like someone caught off guard during a game, but not ruined. That calm confidence from the morning still lingered in her posture, as if even this discovery could be twisted, spun, explained away. I couldn't stay. The air in that room was poison, the sight of the two of them together unbearable. I turned without a word. The image burned into my memory, the sound of their silence trailing after me. Back in the car, I sat gripping the steering wheel, my body trembling, my mind replaying every second. The robe, the laughter, Michael's face. Proof at last. Proof so devastating that it felt like both a wound and a release. There was no denying it anymore. No space left for excuses or fantasies. The truth had stepped out from the shadows and stood in front of me in that hotel doorway. And though it broke me, it also hardened me. This was no longer suspicion. This was betrayal carved into stone. When I finally made it back home, the apartment greeted me with its suffocating silence again. But this time, the silence wasn't the absence of sound. It was the echo of what I had just seen. The image of her standing in that hotel doorway, robe loosely tied, laughter still on her lips, and Michael behind her buttoning his shirt, played in my mind like a cruel loop. Every blink was a photograph, every breath a reminder. Couldn't shut it off. I dropped my keys onto the counter and stared at my hands. They were trembling, though whether from rage or despair, I couldn't tell. It didn't matter. Both had fused into something heavier, something permanent. My chest felt like it had been hollowed out, leaving only a space for bitterness to settle. I should have gone to bed. I should have poured myself a drink, tried to numb the edges of what I had seen. But instead, I wandered into the living room and opened my laptop. I didn't even know what I was looking for, only that I couldn't sit with the silence any longer. I needed to do something, anything, to anchor myself. That's when I opened our shared cloud archive. We had started it years ago. A collection of photos, videos, little _TS of our life together. Vacations, birthdays, anniversaries, lazy afternoons when she insisted on taking a picture of the cat curled in the sunlight. It had once been a treasure chest of memories. Now it felt like walking into a crime scene. The folders loaded slowly, each thumbnail an echo of better times. I scrolled aimlessly until a new video caught my eye. The timestamp was from that same evening, the night she had been in the hotel. My stomach lurched. My hand hovered over the trackpad, shaking, before I finally clicked. The screen filled with her face. She was sitting in a car, illuminated by the glow of streetlights passing overhead. Her hair was loose, her eyes bright, and in her hand was a glass of wine. She was laughing, carefree in a way I hadn't seen in months, maybe years. She raised her glass toward the camera, her lips curling into a mischievous smile. "Cheers," she said, her voice slurred with happiness. Then she added words that cut through me like knives. "Cheers to bad decisions. Her laughter followed, ringing through the speakers, echoing in the hollow of my living room. And then, for just a moment, the camera tilted, catching the reflection of the person sitting beside her. It was him, Michael. His face was clear, unmistakable. He wasn't just a shadow in my suspicions anymore. He was right there, beside her, raising his own glass, sharing in the toast to betrayal. I slammed the laptop shut, but it was too late. The image was branded into my mind. The man who had once stood next to me at my wedding, giving a speech about loyalty and friendship, was the same man now stealing what those words had meant. The man who had shared beers on my porch, who had called me his brother, was the same man laughing beside my wife as they toasted to bad decisions. The weight of that betrayal pressed harder than hers alone. It wasn't just my marriage crumbling anymore. It was the foundation of trust one had built with someone I had once led into the most sacred parts of my life. He hadn't just crossed a line, he had obliterated it. I sat there, staring at the dark screen of the laptop, and my mind drifted backward. I remembered the night of our wedding. Michael had been the one to clap me on the back, his grin wide as he handed me a drink and told me I was the luckiest man alive. He had raised his glass during the toast, his voice steady as he promised to always be there for us. For me, I had believed him. I had believed every word. And now those words felt like mockery. I thought of the countless nights we had spent together, the secrets shared, the laughter. How many times had he been with me, looking me in the eye, while knowing what he was doing behind my back? How many lies had he told without flinching? The sheer calculation of it made me sick. Trust is a fragile thing. You spend years building it, layering it with gestures, words, moments of loyalty. And then, in a single instant, it shatters. What I saw in that video wasn't just proof of her infidelity. It was the obliteration of every bond one thought I could rely on. I tried to breathe, but the air felt thick, poisoned by the images crowding my thoughts. My chest tightened until I pressed my fists against it, as if I could force the weight away. I thought about confronting her, about driving back to that hotel and hammering on the door until the walls shook. I thought about screaming, demanding explanations, breaking through her calm detachment with the fury boiling inside me. But even as I pictured it, I knew it would be useless. Explanations didn't matter anymore. Excuses couldn't undo what had already been recorded, what had already been seen and heard. The video had stripped away all deniability. She wasn't a victim of temptation, wasn't caught in a single reckless mistake. She was laughing, toasting, celebrating the destruction of what we had. She wasn't ashamed. She was proud. And that, more than anything, was the final blow. It's strange how quickly perspective shifts. Just days earlier, I would have clung to any shred of hope, any excuse she offered, to avoid believing what my instincts told me. Now, even if she fell to her knees and begged, I wouldn't believe a word. The mask had slipped. The truth was undeniable. I sat in the dark for what felt like hours. The laptop closed in front of me like a coffin lid. The video played again and again in my head, each detail sharper than the last. Her laughter, his reflection, the clink of their glasses. I realized then that our marriage hadn't ended in that hotel room. It had ended long before, in every secret call, every muted phone, every late-night meeting. The hotel was just the final act, the one I couldn't ignore. And so, as I stared into the dark, I accepted what I had spent months avoiding. She had made her choice, and in making it, she had stripped away not just my trust in her, but in the very idea of loyalty itself. What remained was emptiness, vast and cold. When I finally walked back into the apartment the next day, it felt different, though nothing physical had changed. The same furniture stood in place, the same framed photos smiled from the shelves, the same faint scent of detergent hung in the air. But the weight was different. Everything looked staged now, like a set built for an old play whose actors no longer cared to show up. She was already there, sitting at the kitchen table. As if nothing had happened. As if I hadn't stood in that hotel hallway the night before, staring at her in a robe with Michael behind her. Her posture was calm, upright, deliberate. A cup of coffee sat in front of her, steam curling upward in a soft spiral. She wasn't hiding, wasn't rushing to cover her tracks. She looked like someone who had come home after a routine day at work, steady and unbothered. The sight of her sitting there sent a shiver through me. I expected guilt. I expected fear, maybe even anger at being caught. But instead, her face was still, detached. If there was a flicker of anything in her expression, it was certainty, the quiet, settled certainty of a person who had already moved on. I stood in the doorway longer than I should have, my keys cold in my palm. She didn't rush to fill the silence. She didn't explain, didn't excuse. She simply looked at me with calm, level eyes, and in that gaze, I saw something more painful than an argument. I saw indifference. Indifference is colder than hatred, crueler than rage. Hatred at least acknowledges connection. It shows the other person still matters enough to stir emotion. But indifference says you're no longer relevant. Indifference says the bond is already broken. I sat down across from her, not because I wanted to, but because my legs felt too heavy to keep standing. The chair scraped against the floor, the sound loud in the stillness. She lifted her cup, took a sip, and set it back down with the same composure she had carried through everything. For a long time, I didn't speak. Neither did she. And in that silence, realization crept in deeper than ever. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an accident or a lapse in judgment. This was deliberate, conscious. She had chosen this, chosen him, chosen to dismantle everything we had built piece by piece. I thought back to the promises we had made, the years of weaving our lives together, the dreams once shared over whispered conversations at midnight. None of it mattered now. What she wanted, she had already taken, and what she had abandoned, she didn't intend to reclaim. Her calmness chilled me. It was the same calmness I had seen the morning she came home with that faint mark on her neck. The same calmness with which she pulled the toothbrush and novel from her bag as though they were shields against suspicion. But this time, the performance was over. She didn't need props anymore. Her entire demeanor declared what she refused to say out loud. She was done. And in her certainty, I found clarity too. There was nothing left to fight for. I could scream, accuse, demand explanations, but none of it would change the truth. She had already made her choice, and I was no longer part of it. I looked at her across the table, really looked at her. This woman who had once been the center of my world now felt like a stranger. Her face was the same, her voice the same, her movements familiar. Yet beneath all of it was someone I no longer knew. The transformation wasn't sudden. It had been gradual, creeping, hidden beneath smiles and excuses. But now the mask was gone, and what remained was someone who had left me long before I realized I had been abandoned. The detachment in her eyes wasn't temporary. It wasn't the awkward quiet of someone caught in a mistake. It was the steady gaze of someone already living another life. The realization cut through me with the precision of a blade. I thought of the video in the cloud, her laughter, her toast to bad decisions, Michael's reflection in the glass. That wasn't the laughter of regret. That was celebration. She had celebrated the unraveling of our marriage before I had even accepted it was happening. She reached for her cup again, her hand steady, her expression unchanging. And in that moment I understood. There would be no apology, no remorse. She didn't see what had happened as wrong. To her, it wasn't betrayal, it was liberation. She had already detached herself from the life we had built, and she wasn't looking back. Something inside me cracked then, but not in the way I expected. It wasn't an explosion of rage, not a collapse into grief. It was quieter, colder, a realization that I had been clinging to ashes, trying to rebuild a fire that no longer existed. I felt hollow, emptied out, but in that emptiness, there was a strange kind of clarity. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for her to explain. I wasn't hoping for her to stumble into guilt. I wasn't even expecting her to fight. I simply saw her for what she was. Someone who had made a conscious decision to live a life that didn't include me. I rose from the table, my chair scraping back again. She didn't stop me. She didn't even look up this time. She simply sipped her coffee, calm as ever, as though my leaving was just another detail in a day she had already planned. And as I walked down the hallway, past the photographs, past the memories that no longer held meaning, I realized the truth with a sharp finality. She hadn't been mine for a long time. What I had seen at the hotel, what I had found in the video, what I had confronted in her calm detachment. All of it was just the confirmation. The cold acknowledgement wasn't mine alone. It was hers, written across her face, etched into her silence. She had chosen, and now so had I. I found her letter, not meant for me but for Michael. She wrote of boredom, of her desire to leave me, of how routine had suffocated her. The words cut deeper than the image of her betrayal. I didn't reply. I packed my belongings in silence, left the keys on the table, and placed one final note beside her coffee cup. Don't come back. Good luck with him. The first weeks were hollow, spent drifting between relatives' houses, avoiding questions. But emptiness became space, and space became freedom. I found a small apartment, adopted a second cat, and began writing notes to ease the weight inside me. Slowly, healing replaced grief. When I met Emily, patient, attentive, alive in ways I'd forgotten, I realized I hadn't been destroyed. I had walked out of fire and learned to breathe again.